Welcome back to Rapture Tales. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. Elena Ward never intended to marry into power. She intended to design systems that made power accountable. The morning she first stepped into the glass headquarters of Ward Meridian Holdings, she carried a borrowed leather laptop bag and the kind of exhaustion that comes from balancing 3 freelance consulting contracts at once. The lobby alone could have funded her entire graduate program twice over. White marble floors veined with silver, sculptural lighting suspended like frozen rainfall, and an indoor reflecting pool stretching beneath a suspended staircase. Executives crossed the space with effortless confidence, people born into expensive certainty. Elena crossed it calculating square footage, maintenance cost, and wasted energy efficiency. She wasn't intimidated. She was irritated. Her life had never included excess. She grew up in a coastal Massachusetts town where winters were long and finances longer. Her mother, Lillian Ward, then Lillian Price, taught middle school mathematics and repaired everything in their home herself because repairs were luxuries. Elena learned spreadsheets before she learned makeup. She learned budgeting before she learned dating. Efficiency wasn't a skill to her. It was survival language. Ward Meridian Holdings was the opposite of survival. It was indulgence disguised as legacy, a sprawling real estate conglomerate built on luxury residential towers and high-risk commercial redevelopment projects across major cities. Yet buried inside their public financial filings, Elena noticed a pattern. The company wasn't growing. It was leaking. Cash flow buffers were non-existent. Projects were financed emotionally rather than strategically. She had written a 20-page restructuring proposal on her own time and sent it blindly to a corporate email she assumed no one checked. 3 weeks later she was standing in the building's executive conference level, wondering why a company worth billions had called in a consultant barely past 27. That was when she met Daniel Ward. He didn't look like ownership. No tailored arrogance. No inherited sharpness. He looked tired, sleeves rolled, tie loose, reviewing tenant complaint reports himself instead of delegating. When he introduced himself simply as Daniel from operations, she assumed middle management and spoke to him with the bluntness she reserved for people who actually did work. "You don't have a revenue problem," she told him, sliding her proposal across the table. "You have a pride problem. Your developments are designed for headlines, not occupancy stability. Half your buildings operate below sustainable margin because they're priced for prestige rather than market elasticity." Daniel stared at the document, then at her, not offended, relieved. No one had spoken plainly to him inside this company in years. By the end of that meeting, she had redesigned 3 project funding models on the conference room glass wall using dry erase marker. By evening, she was introduced to the executive board. By night, she discovered Daniel wasn't middle management. He was the heir, Victor Ward's son, and the company's future CEO. She expected embarrassment when he realized she hadn't treated him with deference. Instead, Daniel laughed, a genuine sound, almost boyish, startling in a man raised inside negotiation rooms. "Good," he said. "If you'd known, you might have lied to me like everyone else." That was the beginning. Elena didn't become indispensable overnight. She became unavoidable. Her first weeks inside Ward Meridian Holdings were quiet revolutions disguised as spreadsheets. She discovered vendor contracts unchanged for 11 years, maintenance budgets inflated by loyalty agreements, and vacant luxury penthouses staged for aesthetic instead of rentable functionality. Rather than confront executives, she altered systems, automated expense tracking, dynamic pricing models tied to neighborhood demand indexes, and emergency liquidity cushions tied to project phases. The company stopped bleeding before anyone noticed it had been wounded. Daniel began appearing in her office late evenings, coffee in hand, asking questions no executive ever admitted not knowing. He wasn't incompetent, he was constrained. Raised to inherit leadership yet never allowed to challenge his father's instincts, he carried the constant tension of responsibility without authority. They spoke about work first. Always work. But slowly conversations extended past spreadsheets. Daniel confessed he had studied architecture before being pushed into finance. Elena admitted she rebuilt a restaurant's accounting system at 16 just to help her mother keep it open during winter. They shared a habit of late dinners eaten over documents. They debated design philosophy. He believed buildings should inspire. She believed buildings should function first, inspire second. Their differences fit. 6 months into her consulting contract, Victor Ward summoned her. His office occupied the top floor alone, dark wood, skyline views, silence that felt deliberate. Victor was a man who didn't raise his voice because rooms leaned toward him automatically. His reputation preceded him: visionary developer, ruthless negotiator, patriarch of an empire built on instinct. "You've made my company efficient," he said, reviewing quarterly performance. "Efficiency is useful. But this is not a logistics firm. We build symbols." Elena didn't soften. Symbols collapse if they can't pay their debt cycles. Victor watched her a long moment, measuring not her intelligence but her willingness to oppose him. From that day forward, she was kept close. Not trusted. Studied. Daniel, however, trusted her completely. Too quickly perhaps. He began looping her into strategic discussions before official approvals, relying on her operational foresight to anticipate financial strain. What began as collaboration became dependence, then friendship, then something quieter neither named until it was unavoidable. It happened without spectacle: an exhausted night, rain against the office glass, both asleep over documents, waking at dawn to the city painted gold below them. No confession, just recognition. They married a year later in a private ceremony attended by executives and investors who interpreted the union as strategic alignment. Only Elena knew it had been simpler. She believed she had married a partner. Marriage moved her into the Ward penthouse overlooking the river, minimalist, curated, impersonal. A space designed for legacy photographs rather than living. She adjusted not by redecorating but reorganizing life, scheduled dinners together, unplugged weekends, structured communication habits she believed preserved relationships the same way systems preserved companies. For a time, it worked. With Elena's operational frameworks and Daniel's growing confidence, the company stabilized. Vacancies dropped. Debt exposure decreased. Lenders began offering favorable terms again. Even Victor's expansion plans became safer because Elena quietly built financial cushions beneath them. Reserve accounts layered through subsidiaries designed to protect payroll and emergency liquidity during market fluctuations. She never advertised those buffers. They were insurance, not strategy. But success changed dynamics. Daniel grew busier with investor relations, often traveling. Victor reasserted involvement as profits returned, approving aggressive acquisitions again, projects Elena considered premature. Board members began contacting Victor directly rather than through operational channels she supervised. Meetings occurred without her. Nothing openly hostile. Just gradual exclusion. At dinners Victor spoke to Daniel about legacy, about bloodlines maintaining control, about how outsiders never fully understand generational stewardship. The comments were polite enough to ignore, pointed enough to feel. Daniel always reassured her afterward. "You're imagining tension. He respects you." She wanted to believe him. Yet systems reveal truth people hide. And the first signal appeared not in conversation, but in access permissions quietly changing inside the company database. She no longer had view rights to certain acquisition files. Elena didn't confront anyone. She began watching instead. And the night she finally heard the truth would arrive much later, exactly at the midpoint of everything she thought she understood. Great, I'll continue the continuous narrative and carry the build-up carefully toward the midpoint betrayal while keeping every scene new and progressive. Elena never reacted immediately to anomalies. Reaction created visibility. Visibility created resistance. So she adopted observation the same way she approached failing financial models, quietly, patiently, with timestamps. Her office overlooked the internal courtyard of Ward Meridian's headquarters, a landscaped rectangle surrounded by mirrored glass where executives held informal meetings they believed private. From there, she began reconstructing the company's behavior not from what people told her, but from what systems recorded. Access logs, approval delays, signature reroutes, none alarming individually, but together forming a pattern. Decisions were being consolidated upward. Not toward Daniel as future CEO. Toward Victor alone. The land acquisition files she lost access to belonged to a redevelopment district in Seattle. Large. Expensive. Over-leveraged even before purchase. The type of deal her financial buffers were designed to prevent unless reserves were doubled. Yet financing applications had already begun moving through external lenders. She asked Daniel over dinner, careful, neutral. I noticed Seattle came back into discussion. Are we restructuring the capital stack first? Daniel hesitated, not lying, but unprepared. Dad's still negotiating details. Nothing final yet. He believed that answer, which meant he hadn't been included either. For the first time, Elena felt the faintest separation between her husband and the company they supposedly ran together. A structure forming above them both. She didn't challenge Victor. She expanded her cushions instead. Over the next weeks she redistributed operational surpluses into layered reserve accounts tied to payroll cycles, tax obligations, and emergency vendor coverage, entirely legal, fully documented, but strategically positioned where sudden executive freezes couldn't instantly drain them. She had always done this as protection against economic downturns. Now she did it against people. Their penthouse life grew quieter, not hostile, distant. Daniel worked later, but not with her. Investor dinners, private meetings arranged by Victor, weekend strategy sessions she was not asked to attend. When she asked how they went, he answered vaguely, tired rather than secretive. One evening she found architectural renderings spread across the dining table, not the Seattle project, but a luxury marina development in Monaco the company had no liquidity to pursue simultaneously. You're expanding internationally? She asked carefully. Daniel rubbed his temples. Dad says scale equals stability. If we hesitate, competitors move first. And if cash flow stalls? He smiled weakly. That's why we have you. The statement was affectionate. It was also revealing. They were building strategy assuming she would always fix consequences afterward. Later that night she lay awake beside him studying the ceiling lines of the penthouse, a beautiful structure resting on assumptions, much like the company. She realized she had become a safety net no one consulted before jumping. The realization didn't hurt yet. It prepared. Winter arrived with lender calls. Not crisis calls, inquiries. Financial institutions asking for confirmation on liquidity ratios tied to pending acquisitions. Standard due diligence, except she had not approved those liquidity disclosures. Someone had submitted projections using operational reserve totals as available capital. Her reserves. She requested the disclosure source through internal compliance. The answer returned routed through executive authorization, Victor's office. Not illegal, but intentional. She printed the documents, placed them in a folder, and locked them in her private cabinet instead of confronting him. Confrontation would reveal knowledge before she understood purpose. At dinner that evening Victor spoke warmly about the company's next era, about positioning for legacy expansion. Daniel listened with admiration. Elena listened for omissions. She heard one clearly. Victor described funding structures requiring full asset consolidation, a legal restructuring that would centralize control of all subsidiaries under the parent corporation's discretionary authority. Her authority, gradually erased. She smiled through dessert and asked about vacation plans. The following weeks became a quiet psychological exercise. Elena maintained normal routines, morning coffee with Daniel, weekly calls with property managers, casual lunches with the legal department, while privately mapping how a governance restructure could remove her operational voting power. The answer emerged through spousal clauses tied to executive appointments. If Daniel signed amended governance documents positioning Victor as sole discretionary controller during strategic expansion, her role could be dissolved without termination. Not personal. Procedural. Unless she had leverage. She didn't act yet. Acting without certainty risked accelerating their timeline. Instead she strengthened documentation, ensuring every reserve account, every operational safeguard, every financial stabilization measure she had created was traceable to her executive authority and compliant with corporate bylaws. Protection first. Response later. Daniel noticed her long hours and mistook them for ambition. He brought her dinner one night at the office, sitting on her desk like he used to before marriage complicated simplicity. "You're carrying this company again," he said softly. She studied him, The man she loved, the man increasingly orbiting decisions he didn't control. "I'm carrying stability," she replied. He kissed her forehead, unaware she was no longer sure stability included him. Early spring brought the charity gala, the company's most public annual event, hosted in the atrium beneath a suspended garden installation designed by Daniel years earlier. Investors, city officials, media partners. Victor's natural environment. Elena moved through conversations effortlessly, explaining redevelopment initiatives, calming lenders subtly concerned about aggressive expansion rumors. She noticed Victor introducing Daniel to board members as the future of the name, while introducing her as the operational genius behind the scenes. Compliment and boundary in the same sentence. Near midnight she stepped onto the balcony overlooking the city to breathe. Inside, music and glass laughter blurred into distance. She considered how power inside families differed from power inside corporations. Corporations rewarded competence eventually. Families protected hierarchy indefinitely. Daniel joined her, draping his coat over her shoulders. "You disappeared." "Just thinking." "About work?" She almost said yes. Instead, about permanence. He smiled, assuming romance, and pulled her close while inside Victor negotiated a new acquisition with investors using liquidity she controlled but he planned to claim. Elena rested her head against Daniel's shoulder and understood something with perfect clarity. She loved her husband. But she was starting to prepare for a future where loving him and surviving him might become the same challenge. Perfect, continuing the same continuous narrative flow. We are now entering the middle of the story where tension converts into revelation. Spring turned the city warm enough for open windows, and with it came movement inside the penthouse that felt almost normal again. Daniel scheduled dinners at home instead of restaurants. Victor stopped mentioning acquisitions at the table. Even the legal department slowed its unusual document traffic. To anyone else it would have felt like resolution. To Elena it felt like completion. Not peace, preparation. Patterns didn't disappear in corporations. They concluded in paperwork. The notification arrived on a Thursday afternoon while she reviewed maintenance renewals, a governance amendment draft uploaded for executive review. Not sent to her, stored in a shared archive folder she rarely accessed. Someone had assumed she wouldn't look there. She opened it. The document proposed temporary executive consolidation under Victor Ward during strategic international expansion exposure periods. It included Daniel's provisional signature line as supporting officer. Her own position, Chief Operations Authority, converted into advisory capacity upon activation. No removal. No firing. Just removal of power. Carefully written. Legally elegant. She printed nothing this time. Instead she closed the document and finished her day exactly as scheduled. She left the office at 6. She bought groceries. She asked Daniel about his afternoon. And she waited. Because documents weren't betrayal yet. Intent was. The penthouse was unusually quiet that night. Daniel said he needed to review financial projections with Victor and would use the upstairs study so they wouldn't disturb her. She nodded, carried a book to the living room, and read 3 pages without processing a word. At 9:47 p.m. she rose to make tea. The study door was almost closed. Not fully. Voices carried through the hallway softened by distance but clear enough between pauses. Victor spoke first. "She'll sign if presented as risk containment." Daniel's voice followed, lower. "She reads everything." A pause. Then Victor again, patient, certain. "Then we won't present it for discussion. We present it finalized. By the time she contests it, voting control transfers. Legally she remains comfortable, financially protected. But operationally she's replaceable." Silence. Elena didn't move. Daniel exhaled. "She built the reserves stabilizing this expansion. And she will be compensated for that contribution," Victor replied. "But families maintain leadership within bloodlines. Spouses come and go. Empires don't." Another silence. Longer. Daniel finally, "She'll feel betrayed." Victor, "She'll feel temporary." Which she is. The air in the hallway seemed to thin. Elena realized she wasn't shocked. She was clarified. Then the final sentence, the one that ended the marriage before either man understood it. Daniel spoke quietly. As long as the transition doesn't damage my position with the board. Agreement, not reluctance. The conversation moved to financing schedules. Elena turned away before footsteps could reach the door and returned to the kitchen, poured tea she never drank, and sat in the living room until Daniel joined her 20 minutes later. She smiled when he asked if she was tired. That was the moment the marriage ended. And the strategy began. Elena didn't confront them the next morning. She cooked breakfast. Routine became camouflage, coffee poured, headlines discussed, Daniel's tie straightened before he left. She even reminded him about a lunch meeting he'd nearly forgotten. Victor arrived briefly to pick up documents and greeted her warmly, unaware she now understood her role in his future plans, historical contributor. Once alone, she walked into her home office and opened her laptop. She didn't act emotionally. She acted structurally. For 5 years she had built operational liquidity cushions, reserve pools distributed across subsidiary management accounts to protect payroll and vendors during downturns. Fully authorized under her operational authority, compliant with bylaws, and legally movable for risk mitigation. If Victor consolidated authority, those reserves would transfer under his discretionary control. Unless they were moved first. She called the company's external compliance attorney, Marianne Keller. Not unusual, they spoke weekly. I need confirmation on executive asset protection rights tied to operational risk exposure, Elena said calmly. Marianne asked a few technical questions, unaware of context, and confirmed. As active operational officer, she could legally reallocate reserves into protective trusts if she reasonably believed company stability and personal fiduciary liability were threatened by executive restructuring. Elena thanked her, hung up, and opened the financial dashboard. She didn't hesitate after that. The transfers began at 11:12 p.m. that night. She waited until Daniel slept, genuinely slept, not pretending, before moving to the office overlooking the dark river skyline. The city lights reflected across the glass as if she worked inside another version of the same room. Each movement required authentication, documentation, justification entries written in professional language. She drafted them carefully: risk exposure mitigation, liquidity protection, fiduciary safeguard allocation. Every action legal. Every timestamp recorded. Accounts shifted into a private trust under her maiden name, a name not associated with a ward corporate structure, created years earlier on her attorney's advice she had never expected to use. $14,800,000. Operational cushion capital she designed, preserved, and now secured. She finished near dawn, shoulders tight but hands steady. No alarms triggered. No policies violated. Only control relocated. Before sunrise she returned to bed and slept for 40 minutes. Daniel woke beside her believing the world remained unchanged. He kissed her goodbye before leaving for work. Elena wished him a good day. The first sign appeared 2 days later. Payroll preparation required confirmation of reserve backing during expansion phases. Accounting flagged a discrepancy, temporary, they assumed, and requested verification. Elena approved payroll using existing operational cash flow, allowing the question to escalate upward naturally. By afternoon Victor's office requested a liquidity overview. She provided one, accurate, documented, legally complete, but missing the reserves. Calls began arriving from lenders seeking confirmation of internal backing ratios previously disclosed. Victor summoned Daniel. Daniel texted her, "Do you know why treasury numbers look different this week?" She replied, "We should discuss it at the board meeting." For the first time in their relationship, she withheld reassurance. And for the first time, Daniel felt uncertainty around her. Tension grew invisibly across days. Victor's tone sharpened in meetings. Emergency financial reviews were scheduled. Executives searched for accounting errors that did not exist. Elena performed her role perfectly: cooperative, analytical, calm, never obstructing investigation, never volunteering explanation. At night Daniel tried to read her expressions, sensing distance he couldn't define. "You've been somewhere else lately," he said one evening. "I've been preparing," she answered truthfully. "For what?" She met his eyes steadily. For the consequences of decisions already made. He didn't understand. The board meeting was scheduled for Friday morning, the same meeting Victor intended to formalize governance restructuring. Elena confirmed attendance and placed a folder in her bag. Inside, every document she had collected, and every proof she would need. Continuing the story, final arc and resolution. The boardroom occupied the top floor beneath a ceiling of smoked glass that reflected the city like a second horizon suspended above them. By the time Elena entered Friday morning, every seat except Victor's was filled. Directors murmured in tight clusters, papers already spread before them. The air waited with a peculiar stillness that forms when people know something significant will happen but no one yet knows its shape. Daniel stood near the windows, jacket off, tension visible in the way he kept adjusting his cufflinks without noticing. When he saw her, relief crossed his face, instinctive, almost searching. For a moment she saw the man she had married before ambition rearranged his loyalties. Then Victor entered and the room reorganized around him, gravity reclaiming its center. The meeting opened formally. Quarterly performance. Expansion outlook. Predictable structure masking intent. Elena listened as Victor guided discussion toward governance restructuring, presenting it as protective efficiency during aggressive international exposure. Calm, rational, carefully phrased so opposition sounded irresponsible. Then the document packets were distributed. She accepted hers without expression though she had memorized every clause days ago. The proposal transferred operational authority upward, reducing her role to advisory oversight. Polite exile. Permanent. Victor looked at her for the first time since the meeting began. Elena, given your contributions, I trust you understand the necessity. Several directors nodded sympathetically, not conspirators, merely convinced by logic prepared for them. Daniel avoided her eyes. She closed the packet gently. I understand necessity, she said evenly. I just don't believe you've identified the correct risk. The room shifted, subtle but immediate. Victor's brow tightened almost imperceptibly, the first sign he sensed deviation from expectation. Elena opened her folder. She didn't start with the money. She started with the land. A new set of documents appeared on the display screen. Acquisition agreements for the Seattle waterfront redevelopment Victor had kept partially undisclosed. Not illegal, but financed through layered debt exposure tied to short-term liquidity ratios. Ratios calculated using reserve funds no longer available. Directors leaned forward. Questions began before Victor could respond. Elena, where did these projections come from? Internal filings submitted to lenders, she answered calmly. Filed under consolidated asset assumptions. She turned pages slowly, controlling pace. She explained risk cascades, how a minor market delay would trigger loan acceleration clauses, forcing emergency capital injections the company could not sustain without operational reserves. Victor interrupted, controlled but sharp. Those reserves exist. She met his gaze. They existed under operational protection structures designed to prevent exactly this exposure. Daniel finally spoke. What are you saying? Now she placed the final document on the table. 3 nights ago, I overheard plans to remove my authority before this deal activated. As acting operational officer responsible for fiduciary liability, I secured the reserves into protective trust to prevent unauthorized exposure. Silence filled the room completely. Victor's voice lowered. Dangerous. You moved company capital. I relocated operational risk buffers within my legal authority after governance alteration was planned without disclosure, she replied. Every transfer documented. Every clause compliant. She handed copies to the board. The company attorney, summoned urgently into the meeting, reviewed pages line by line. Minutes stretched long enough for reality to settle over the room. The reserves were inaccessible for Victor's expansion, which meant the acquisition endangered the company. Directors' attention turned, not toward Elena, but toward Victor. Questions sharpened. Why had exposure not been disclosed? Why were projections dependent on protected funds? Why was governance restructuring scheduled before financial review? Daniel looked between them, comprehension dawning in pieces rather than a single blow. He wasn't the architect of the plan. He had simply accepted its logic. And now he realized Elena had protected the company from a strategy that would have bound his future to potential collapse. Victor attempted to regain control through authority. She acted unilaterally. Elena answered softly, almost gently. I acted to prevent unilateral decisions from endangering the corporation. The attorney cleared her throat. Based on documentation, Ms. Ward's actions fall within her fiduciary obligations given undisclosed risk exposure. The balance shifted completely. The vote scheduled to remove Elena never occurred. Instead, a motion opened investigation into executive disclosure practices. And for the first time in decades, Victor Ward had no immediate majority in the room. The aftermath unfolded quietly rather than explosively. Victor did not shout. He adjourned the meeting early, but momentum had moved beyond his control. Over the following days, independent auditors reviewed acquisition exposure and governance conduct. Directors who once deferred now questioned. Investors preferred stability to legacy pride. Daniel attempted conversation that night inside the penthouse, pacing the living room where they once shared ordinary evenings. You could have told me, he said, voice strained. I did, she answered. You just didn't hear me when it mattered. He struggled, caught between loyalty and recognition. I never meant, you meant to let it happen, she said, not cruelly, simply precise. You chose position over partnership. I chose survival over assumption. There was no argument left after truth becomes clear enough. She had already arranged separate residence. The divorce remained private. No scandal, no accusations. Assets divided according to agreements drafted years earlier when love made fairness easy to sign. Daniel did not contest them. Perhaps he understood the cost already paid. Victor resigned 2 months later under board pressure following the audit findings. Officially retirement. Unofficially removal. Elena did not celebrate. She worked. She returned the protected reserves to corporate accounts under new transparency structures approved unanimously by the board, now led by her. Expansion projects were renegotiated, scaled responsibly, some cancelled entirely. Profit growth slowed initially, then stabilized stronger than before. Employees noticed changes first: clearer reporting channels, fewer emergency directives, predictable payroll cycles. Investors noticed next: consistent performance instead of volatile ambition. The company became quieter, healthier. A year later, Elena stood alone in the same boardroom at dusk, the glass ceiling reflecting city lights as they once had the morning of confrontation. Nothing dramatic marked the moment, just the end of another steady quarter. She no longer lived in the penthouse. Her apartment overlooked a smaller river, chosen because she liked hearing traffic at night, proof of ordinary life beyond empires. She kept her maiden name professionally again, not as rejection of the past, but ownership of herself. Power, she had learned, wasn't domination or revenge. It was preparation. It was calm decisions made before crises forced them. It was protecting stability even when others mistook restraint for weakness. She turned off the boardroom lights and left the building with no audience watching. The empire remained. But now it finally had a leader who valued survival over pride. And that, more than inheritance, was what made it endure. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.